Hey, welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ the Book Witch, and this is my September wrap-up. Alright, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. First, stats. I read 26 books last month, and still somehow only managed to read half of what I covered on my TBR. I also did a lot of rereading. So now that I'm developing more of a palate, okay, let's say tolerance, for romance, I wanted to go back and see if I felt any differently about some of the more modern romances that I read last year. Mixed reviews. But as far as ratings go, I read 5 5-star, 8 4-star, 2 3.5-star, 9 3-stars, and 1 2.5-star. I totaled 9,332 pages, averaging 311 pages per day, which is pretty decent. Now, obviously, I will not be able to keep up this pace through the rest of the year, but this breakneck speed did allow me to read an alarming number of trashy romance novels and ultimately get caught up and recover from my 4-month-long summer reading slump. So now I am confident to say that I am back on track for my Goodreads goal of 200 books this year, and I am currently on number 155. Okay, let's see what we've got. Also, do you notice my candy corn sweater? Let's start with middle grade. I read 3 middle grade books this month, and they were a huge success. I'm slanted. I'm crooked. Oh, that's embarrassing. Okay, I'm done. I facilitated today at my job. I'm not a facilitator. I'm a performer. No, I'm kidding. I'm a writer, and so I don't normally get this much FaceTime with people. When I do, it goes to my head. That's why I'm a little high energy today. You're welcome. The Halloween Moon by Joseph Fink. Esther loves Halloween, but when her parents tell her that she's too old to go trick-or-treating, Esther sneaks out of the house in full costume anyway. But soon, Esther finds herself navigating the scariest Halloween ever, in which her favorite holiday has been hijacked by mysterious strangers with peculiar powers. 5 stars. Maybe the easiest 5 stars that I've ever given to a middle grade. This is the perfect middle grade book for readers who like the plotline of Peter Pan and the aesthetic of Hocus Pocus. It's your classic coming-of-age story unfolding underneath the full moon on Halloween night. It is your perfect blend of creepy, heartwarming, and very funny. And the voice of the protagonist leaps off every page. So this book was perfect for me in so many ways. So my favorite book of all time, forever and ever amen, is Peter Pan. I'm absolutely fascinated by the moment when a child recognizes and then chooses their own maturity. And it's rare, I think, to see that moment captured with grace, humor, and this deep sense of longing, because it is a death in a way. But Fink captures it, and he wrestles with it, and he lets this moment breathe and expose itself in so many ways, both obvious and subtle. And it was really beautiful. But then also, Halloween. I love Halloween. I love anything spooky all times of the year, really. But Halloween is just this magical liminal time when the spooky merges with the spiritual, and things that seemed impossible yesterday might just make total sense in the moonlight. And Fink captures this. He writes about Halloween as both an Americana aesthetic and an ethereal experience. It's at times creepy and unsettling, and sad and moving, and crazy and colorful, and above all, fun. And the last thing I want to say is, I very rarely notice a middle grade for its sentence by sentence writing. And maybe that's on me, because when I think about writing, especially of a middle grade book, I think in terms of mechanics. So does the storytelling work for me? Do I like the structure or the character arcs as a whole? And in all honesty, I'm pretty critical of middle grades. But that's because it's what I write and it's what I love the most. So that being said, every once in a while, if I come across a phrasing or sentence or even a passage that I think was written spectacularly, I'll mark it or indicate it so I can come back to it and analyze it. And with this book, I was doing that 2 or 3 times a page, and it was almost always the narration of the protagonist. Her character is so defined and so likable and relatable and funny that she just leaps off the page. The way that she was written at the sentence level, her tone, the blend between the confidence and awkwardness of her age, those straight vibes, I was blown away. And I want to read anything and everything I can by this author. Okay, are you convinced yet? If you're not in it for the artistry, maybe you'll be in it for the Halloween witch, or the villains who ride around in a converted ice cream truck, or the razor blade candy, or the exploding pumpkins, or the zombie trick-or-treaters. Either way, I highly recommend this haunting Halloween read. Next is The Books of Elsewhere, Spellbound by Jacqueline West. So this is the second installment of the Books of Elsewhere series. This series is about a girl named Olive who is the daughter of 2 mostly absent but otherwise pretty funny mathematicians. And they moved into this big creepy house that was previously owned by a mysterious painter and his granddaughter who was a witch. In the first book, Olive discovered several secrets about the house, including 3 talking cats with extremely distinct personalities who guard the house, and several paintings throughout the house that she can skidoo right into just like in Blue's Clues. She just jumps right in and interacts with the oil paint people. It's very unsettling, especially when she got trapped in one by the ghost of the granddaughter witch. The ghost of the witch granddaughter? The granddaughter witch's ghost. The ghost of her? Her ghost. The witch's ghost. Yeah. This book is about Olive's search to find the witch's grimoire, or book of spells, to help save her friend who is still trapped in an oil painting in the hallway. 5 stars. This book is delightful and fast-paced, with elements of spooky mystery and lots of humor. It's just a good time. Okay, I think we're gonna have to cover romance next because there are just so many of them, and I want to finish with some of the killer books that I read this month, so let's just get right into it. Alright, I'm doing this by series because there is no way I'm going to sit here and walk you through the individual plot lines of each of these ridiculous novels. Okay, so I mentioned that almost all of my romance novels that I read last month are rereads. This is true. I wanted to go back and see if I felt any differently about them again. Because when I first read, I should say devoured, romance novels back in 2020, I was an ignorant fool, reading without discernment and not realizing that there are actually subcategories of romance. And much like when you find yourself on the wrong side of TikTok, I had found myself on the wrong side of the Kindle Unlimited algorithm, and much of what I read ran together. So in rereading them, I wanted to see if I could tell them apart. And the answer is mostly no. Okay, so the first series is by Ashley Jade, and it's called Royal Hearts Academy. And the books include Cruel Prince, which is actually how I first stumbled across this series while I was searching for Holly Black's arguable masterpiece on my Kindle, and came across this one. Ruthless Knight, which is kind of a mouthful, doesn't really roll off the tongue. Wicked Princess, and Broken Kingdom. So this series follows these characters of a particular family who all experience the collective trauma of having one of their siblings commit suicide. So each book shows how each of the different siblings deals with their trauma, how they are terrible romantic partners because of their unresolved trauma, and how they're just kind of horrible people overall. Now, the upside, I do think that the author did a good job of using one specific incident to anchor all of these stories together. I think it was done well, and I think it was neat because you were able to get a good sense of the character that had died because you saw it from so many different characters' perspectives. Downside, straight 3s across the board. I did give one a 3.5, rounding back down to a 3 on Goodreads, because one of the love interest characters had an eating disorder, and I think that it was written and handled well. So that gave it some brownie points, but overall, right down the plate. So once again, the Royal Academy books were Cruel Prince, Ruthless Knight, Wicked Princess, and Broken Kingdom. Okay, but then there's this whole other series by Rena Kent, and it's the Royal Elite series, and it has Cruel King, leveling up, Steel Princess, Twisted Kingdom, Black Knight, Vicious Prince, and a Royal Elite Epilogue, which is a mashup of epilogue scenes from each book that no one asked for. So this series follows 4 dudes in high school who are all jocks on the football team, but European football, so soccer. Anyway, they're all really bro-y, but also really brooding and very violent and pretty emotionally constipated. So think of like your worst mashup of Edward and Jacob, like Edward in Jacob's body. That's the gist. They're all written kind of the same. All of the dude characters are pretty indistinguishable from each other, and then they all fall for girls who are all just different forms of pretty. So individual standalones in the same universe, but even still, I wouldn't necessarily recommend one book over the other. They're all kind of the same, and it's all like a package deal, kind of like gummy worms. You know, like the sour green might taste like slightly different from the sour red, but you're still gonna eat them all at once and not know the difference and still have like a really weird taste in your mouth for like an hour afterwards. So this series anchors around a few different interwoven backstories and some pretty dark trauma. The upside is that because the premise is so wildly outlandish, what with these 17 and 18-year-olds being jacked like 30-year-old weightlifters and having the agency power and resources to be able to just pick up and board flights to Paris, you're able to fly through these pages. The downside is that in doing so, you'll discover that they're all straight 3s. I think I did give one, again, a 3.5, rounding down to 3, because it had more of like a mystery or an element of thriller or suspense to it. I really don't remember. It's only been 2 weeks and they're already all running together. So I think that tells you what you need to know. And then there were 2 other series that I didn't hate, and that's probably because they were written by C.M. Stunick, of whom I am admittedly a fan. So even with her books, though, I find them kind of hit or miss, both as a series as a whole and also with books themselves. I find that I love parts and aspects of her book, and then equally I'm frustrated by other parts and aspects. So it's kind of a toss-up. But for these 2 series in particular, they're both set in private schools, the Adamson All-Boys Academy and Burberry Prep. The first series I liked much more, the Adamson All-Boys Academy. And this series includes The Secret Girl, The Ruthless Boys, and The Forever Crew. Now, C.M. Stunick is a writer of reverse harem stories, so you should probably know that going in. And the premise of this series in particular, as you can probably assume from the title of the first installment, is there's a girl at school, but it's a secret. Yeah, so Charlotte's father was just made headmaster at a boarding school. He plucks his daughter up from her school in sunny California and whisks her to this boarding school in Vermont or somewhere equally New Englandy, and she would be the first girl in the history of this school to attend. But Charlotte doesn't want all of the attention that being the first girl would bring, so she begs her dad to let her attend as a dude, and she goes in drag, very She's the Man style, and it's all a good time. Except she's kind of an asshole, and she makes enemies with just about everyone, including the student council, who's made up of all boys, who, not unlike the royal elite over in Rena Kent world, have an alarming amount of power pool and resources for teenage dudes. But this is fantasy, so we can just go with it. Anyway, yeah, eventually she's discovered and romance happens. Except there's also murder. Yeah, there's lots and lots of murder, and someone is out to kill Charlie, which personally, considering her attitude towards like everyone at school, feels kind of inevitable. But I appreciated the murdery elements, and I can't imagine that it's easy writing organic romance plots for 5 dudes at once. And I think Stunick manages it nicely, and it feels fluid. I'd say 4 stars down the board, which is the same as I would give any contempo romance that hits all the marks. The other series is The Bad Boys of Burberry Prep. Now already I'm put off by the title of this series. I personally do not believe in using the term bad boy unless you're being unequivocally ironic or you're referring to a car and loudly slapping its hood. But anyway, the series is about a bunch of dudes at Burberry Prep, and it includes filthy rich boys, bad blue bloods, the envy of idols, and in the arms of the elite. Now, fish out of water situation. This is about a fancy prep school and one girl who is attending on scholarship. And because she's poor, she's absolutely tormented, mostly by this group of dudes who belong to the Infinity Club, which is like a gang of billionaires and world influencers, essentially. And their kids have like a high school division of the Infinity Club. So anyway, she's bullied, tormented, it's exhausting. But the upside to this series is that the second book was actually very good. Now, I say that it wasn't the paragon of literature or anything, but it does have a really good revenge plot, and I love a good revenge plot. Like a solid revenge setup. The entire first book was just her getting fucked over by these dudes. But in the second book, she's back and she's badass and she has a new short haircut and she has a list of names that she crosses off one by one with red lipstick. I'm here for it. And then through the whole thing, she makes all these dudes fall in love with her. Oh yeah, and then also this prince, this actual cousin to the English throne royal prince, shows up halfway through the book, and he's this weird, reckless trickster character who just adds a ton of drama and stress to the whole situation. I really enjoyed the second book. The other two books are whatever. I mean, they do finish out the story, but personally my interest went way down once she finished her revenge list and fewer people started dying. Oh yeah, I did read one normal contemporary romance, Accidental Tryst by Natasha Boyd. This one is about a guarded woman and a flirty businessman who bump into each other at an airport and accidentally swap phones for a week. As it turns out, I actually rated this one lower than I did all of the other ones. So yikes. I rated it 2.5 stars, rounding up to 3. Here's why. The premise was promising, but things move weirdly fast for there to be very little communication between the two characters. Like all they do is text, and not often. And when they do text, there's no chemistry. So in a typical rom-com, you expect the romance to sort of hinge around some big ol' misunderstanding. But that is not the case here, just two adults texting a lot. One is uber perfect and rich and dates lots of women. And the other is a sad, guarded, Hallmark movie watching cat having been hurt before brunette with tangled hair who's like weirdly obsessed with commitment but also can't commit herself because what if she gets hurt? And that conflict is what drives the crux of the story. So those were my romance reads. Moving on to nonfiction. I read one nonfiction book last month, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity and Racism by Jamar Tisby. This is a thoughtful review of American history and the role that the American church played in the participation, sustainment, and then the long-standing consequences of the institution of chattel slavery. Now, what I can appreciate is that this book is written by a practicing Christian. So while it provides an honest portrayal of the church's participation in racist systems both past and present, it still offers a hopeful outlook for the church's participation in social justice moving forward. I would recommend this book to practicing Christians who want to self-examine our country's past and the way that structures and systems are upheld by institutions who refuse to interfere, like the church. Because of its hopeful nature and the perspective of being written by a believer, I think it would be easier for Christians to identify with and find hopeful and helpful actions toward change. Fantasy. Fantasy. In fantasy, I read Gods and Monsters by Shelby Mahurin. This is the third installment of the Serpent and Dove series, featuring Serpent and Dove, Blood and Honey, and Gods and Monsters. And just wow. Okay, so I've actually been kind of nervous to review this one because the last time I talked about this book, it was the morning after I had just finished it. I stayed up until like 3:30 or 4 the night before to finish it. And I asked my husband, hey, can I tell you about this book I just read? And before I knew it, it had been almost 2 hours and I was walking him through every single plot point and twist of the series, absolutely gushing about it. So I'm not going to do that again. But I could. This series takes place in a fantasy-like France where witches are hunted by chasers who are a specifically ordained witch hunting division of the Catholic Church. So the series centers on Lou. She's a gutter snipe on the run from her own coven, specifically her mother, who is a very powerful witch. And in a quick move to save herself, she agrees to marry a chaser. And the entire book is kind of on this romance between Lou and Reed, the chaser. And so her only hope is that by the time Reed discovers her true nature, that he agrees to honor their wedding vows over his sworn oath to kill her. So the first book, I thought, great setup. It's a good holistic plot in and of itself, but it also does a really good job of setting up the entire world for a trilogy. The second book had all of the problems and exhaustions typical to a sequel. The world got a little too big too fast. It was very emotionally draining, and there wasn't enough plot movement to help balance out the weight of the emotional trauma that all of the characters were enduring. So it does feel very heavy. You will need a nap after reading it. But this book, it's the conclusion. This book builds and builds to basically that final boss battle at the end that makes everything worth it. And my biggest fear was that it was going to be rushed, right? That it was going to be over too quickly, and it wouldn't be worth all of the heaviness of the emotional turmoil that Mahurin put her characters through. But that was not the case. This felt huge. It felt important, and it was written so well, and it was such a major part of the book. But also, the entire book wasn't just getting us to this battle. There was a lot of plot in the entire third book. It's a lot. In fact, even in the first act, there was this incredibly well-written, very visual, very cerebral battle that took place just in the first act alone. But in addition to all of the battle and action and plot movement of this book, there's also a major subplot in the romance between the two main characters. And it kind of causes you to question the validity of their relationship. Was it fair that Reed fell in love with Lou before he knew that she was a witch? And in doing so, did she betray him first? The female friendships in this book are immaculate. The writing is tense and extraordinary. And my favorite moment came from my least favorite character. It was a real Neville Longbottom type of moment, and you just want to cheer. I wanted to cheer, but it was 3:30 in the morning, so I didn't. 5 stars, obviously. I highly recommend this book. I recommend the trilogy, but do read this with a pillow and some snacks because you're going to need to take frequent breaks. Okay, so the last book that I read was a graphic novel called Bloodlust Bonnets by Emily McGovern. This was an absolutely hilarious book. It's about a group of vampire hunters led by Lucy, who teams up with Lord Byron from books and a mysterious bounty hunter named Sham. And they all have their own personal motives that they refuse to share with each other. So sometimes their paths align and sometimes they completely conflict, but they all work together, and it just ends up in this hilarious mess of inside jokes and literary puns that are both very witty and very silly. 5 out of 5, would definitely recommend, especially for bookish people. Whew! We did it, you guys. We just went over 26 books, and I think I'm done talking for a while. So now I want to hear from you. What did you read last month? Did you read any of the books that I just mentioned? Do you want to? Let me know below. And then you know the drill. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you loved it, hit subscribe. And of course, there's always Instagram. But thanks for sticking around. Take care. And as always, happy reading.